Welcome to the Contreras Report. I'm Raul Lowry Contreras, your correspondent. Today we're going to talk about a professor, a famous professor, who lies and cheats and steals his way through infamy in writing very bad things about people like me, Mexicans. So we'll talk about that. Then we're going to talk about Texas and what a gutless state law enforcement agency departments they have that are run by a gutless coward of a governor. Then we're going to talk about something different, a little foreign policy. I was invited to address a panel in New York City and at the Turkish mission to the United Nations, and I did so on April 23rd. We have the video here, which you'll enjoy, I believe. It's called The Call to Truth, 1915. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Mexico and the problems that are existing in Mexico today in the conflict, literally conflict, almost with shooting of the president of Mexico and the Mexican Supreme Court, and how they have tangled with each other to the point where the president is trying to change the whole judicial system in Mexico because the Supreme Court, doesn't agree with the president and what he's trying to do. Okay, so let's start with item number one. What would a reasonable person call a career professor at California State University, Fresno, who smeared children of illegal immigrants from Mexico? To wit, illegal aliens from Mexico have, or their children, have no appreciation or attachment to education like Americans do. In a non-sourced, no footnotes diatribe entitled Mexifornia, A State of Becoming, that was published by a non-profit publisher in San Francisco, Professor Victor Davis Hanson insulted and smeared Mexicans just as his president did years later when he announced for president. The professor attacked Mexican farm workers in his neighboring Central California for being anti-education, of generally being thieves, and of being criminal lawbreakers. He passionately believes, as former President Donald J. Trump does, that Mexicans are rapists, criminals, and aren't the best, Mexico says to the U.S. Plus, his background of never serving in the U.S. military shows when he accuses the children of illegally present from Mexico for not being loyal to the U.S. Really. In fact, one, possibly two young men who were brought to the U.S. as children illegally not only served like so many Mexican Americans have done and are doing, but they were awarded the highest military award of the United States, the Congressional Medal of Honor, for bravery in combat during the Vietnam War. Fresno State, where Hanson taught, had 25,000 students when he retired, of which 12.1% were of Asian background. No surprise there. Bit of a surprise is that 18.3% of the Fresno student body were non-Hispanic whites. And, drumroll, 54.7% were Hispanic, Mexicans, Mexican Americans, which of course can be of any race. Fresno County is number 2 in U.S. agricultural production. The area is mostly Mexican, with a large farm worker population that earns an annual average of $31,500, while at the same time, California's annual household income is $84,000 by comparison. So you have a bunch of really poor people that are struggling to survive, whose children are managing to go to college with a tuition that costs a lot of money. Nonetheless, Mexican parents work hard in their fields, and their kids are going to college in between hours and days and weeks working in the fields with their parents. If, as Hanson smears in his writing, Mexicans don't appreciate education, How is it that 54% of his campus was and are the very people he dismisses as not appreciating education and implying that they are incapable of being educated, but they're there? He also says they are generally thieves. He writes in his book his peaches from his peach farm or peach orchard were stolen by these people and didn't even offer to pay for them. And he says they break the law every time they take a breath in the United States because, of course, they're here illegally. Apparently, Professor Victor Davis Hanson doesn't know that despite being one of the rarest creatures on Earth, a University of California PhD career professor whose political lips are firmly planted on Donald J. Trump's ample rump, some of his writings are highly inaccurate. Inaccurate to the point that his declarations are so unlikely, untrue, and sheer propaganda that they and he must be called out. In the ultra-conservative publication Town Hall, we find a Hanson essay that shows off his views on, among other things, race, racism, and a new word, racialist demagogues. We also see how he simply does not see what he sees, or he doesn't understand what he sees. For example, he writes that President Biden, quote, inherited energy independence, unquote. Sorry, Mr. Professor, but you're wrong. The U.S. imported millions of barrels of oil every month that Trump was president. Every single month. Professor Hanson is totally wrong. He says Biden inherited, quote, historically low interest rates, quote, and they're gone. So what, Professor? So did Trump. More importantly, Professor, I have some experience in this field. I worked for a decade as a mortgage lender, and the first loan I wrote in 1982 was an 18% VA loan. 18%, sir. Correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, but the president was Ronald Reagan, and he'd been in office for 2 years. Nonetheless, the first loan I wrote was an 18% government loan, government-backed loan. Biden, Hanson writes, inherited, quote, low crime rate, unquote. Well, so did Trump. But Trump, while was president, saw crime rates grow rapidly in 2020, the last full year of his presidency while he was president. And they're still going up, although they appear to have leveled off. Biden inherited rising crime rates, sir. As a historian, you should be more accurate. Trump, Hanson says, quote, largely closed border with legal-only immigration, unquote. False, 100% false, 1,000% false. Trump only constructed 55 miles of new Trump fence during his 4 years. Other fencing that he constructed was to replace previous fencing, some of which was just strictly strands of barbed wire. His people, those officers and agents in the field that carried badges and guns, did something really bad, and he did nothing to stop it. His people, these were his people, violated federal laws on the border and state laws, state and federal laws on the border that amounted to the government taking children away from parents and losing them. If private people had done what they did, they would be guilty of kidnapping, which is punishable by death in a number of states, and I think in the federal government. There are still more than 1,000 children that were stolen from their parents while Trump was in the White House that have not been reunited with their families. Perhaps the professor doesn't understand that hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants in the U.S. show up for work every day. Victor Davis Hanson owns a Central Valley peach orchard that he inherited, so he knows what the situation is, the daily situation. Yet he refuses to admit that these illegal workers are the lifeblood of agriculture west of the Mississippi River and in Florida and in Fresno. Hanson writes that, quote, Biden's family is corrupt from top to bottom, unquote. He does not support that with any proof that has been presented in a court of law. He smears the president's family, while he doesn't mention that Donald Trump's grandfather was a procurer of prostitutes after being expelled from Germany for draft evasion, which Donald Trump was guilty of, and that Donald's father was suspected of cheating on government contracts during World War II. And, a little footnote, the New York Times reported in 1926 that Frederick Trump of Queens, we believe that's the same man, was arrested for assaulting a police officer at a Ku Klux Klan rally in New York City. But Donald himself was ordered to pay a $300,000 fine for hiring illegal aliens from Poland working on a building he was tearing down. So apparently he approves of illegal aliens from Poland if they're working for him and he's making money by paying them less. But he doesn't approve of the Mexican illegal immigrants who are in his own valley, his own town, his own county, picking all the crops that feed all of America and sometimes the world. And for a moment, should we forget that Victor Davis Hanson does not mention that Donald Trump himself is out on his own recognizance bail. He's out of jail while awaiting trial on 34 felony charges. More importantly, Victor Davis Hanson, this great professor of history, does not mention that Trump is facing additional serious charges, federal charges in Florida, and state charges in Georgia by both federal and state authorities that apparently don't faze his deep-seated view of this man who did not defend and protect the Constitution on January 6, 2021. In other words, as President of the United States, he failed. And there are some people who would say he aided and abetted those people who were attacking the United States. Apparently, he is also unaware, Trump is unaware, and that Victor Davis Hanson is unaware, that Trump's family, his son-in-law and favorite daughter, his only daughter, well, by his first wife, his favorite daughter, that Jared and Ivanka have managed to suck billions of dollars out of Middle East oil oligarchs, that it's obvious the arrangements were made while they were collecting government paychecks in the White House. Victor Davis Hanson, historian, not so hot. Let's move on now to the state of Texas. Legal, illegal guns and dead people. Here we go again, guns and illegal residents. In Texas, a man buys a semi-automatic rifle designed and manufactured to look like a weapon of war. He shoots 5 people, including a 9-year-old child, and the gun nuts claim it wasn't the rifle that killed these people, it was the man who shot and killed them. That makes sense to some people throughout the country. The gun doesn't kill, the shooter does. Okay, I'll go along with that. But then the glorified clerks of the Customs and Border Patrol reveal the shooter is in the country illegally and has been previously deported back to Mexico. Then the governor's office announces a $50,000 reward for the shooter's capture, and on the side mentions the 5 dead were here illegally from Honduras. Okay. But Mr. Governor, Abbott is his name, as far as we know, none of the 21 people killed in Uvalde, Texas, in an elementary school a year ago, were in the country illegally, nor was the shooter. nor, we think, were any of the dozens upon dozens of badge-wearing, gun-toting deputy sheriffs, city cops, school police, Texas Rangers, and the Border Patrol. As far as we know, every officer or agent was a U.S. citizen. Is that why they all stood around while little 10-year-olds were being slaughtered? Is that why every Texas Ranger there or in the Ranger chain of command hasn't been fired? They were citizens? And why haven't you, Mr. Governor, focused on the inactivity of all law enforcement in Uvalde and for their incompetence, their cowardice, and their singular lack of courage? In fact, Mr. Governor, why haven't you admitted your incompetence for not firing every single Texas Ranger or Department of Public Safety officer who lied to all of us about state officer incompetence and the cowardice of every state officer present during the slaughter of all those kids? Why expose this episode committed by and against people in the country illegally? Simple. Apparently, the rifles involved were bought legally. The dead were legal and illegal. The instruments of death were both legal. It is illegal for an illegal resident to own a rifle or pistol in the United States of America. It's against federal law. Nonetheless, this Texas illegal resident bought a rifle. From whom? How? And why, Mr. Governor, haven't you made an announcement of how this weapon wound up in the alleged shooter's hands? Doesn't the state of Texas care if guns are sold illegally? What's more important, Mr. Governor, the sale and possession of a rifle or gun, or is the buyer's legal ability to own it more important? And another question, where is the Texas Attorney General? Where is the commission to investigate Uvalde and the questions about the behavior of every law enforcement officer present during the slaughter and the officials who looked into the event and have lied through their teeth since then to the public, if they say anything to the public? Is he too busy burying the criminal indictments against him? Indictments for felonies that were filed against him 8 years ago? Governor Abbott, don't you people try criminals anymore? Unless, of course, they're Mexican. Item 3. A jet plane flew me across the United States to New York City, where I participated in a panel discussion about something that happened 100 years ago. The 90 or so miles between Philadelphia and New York on April 21 and 23 seemed like a million miles apart. Why? In Philadelphia, people gathered to discuss, of all things, an alleged genocide of a people a century ago and the misinformation permeating that event then and since. The countries, modern-day Turkey with its 85 million people and Armenia with its 2.79 million people. The event in New York on April 23rd was a call to truth, historical facts of 1915 events. The time 1915, 1923. The allegations were Ottoman Empire deliberately murdered and slaughtered and starved and killed by other maltreatment in the extreme of an alleged 600,000 to 1.5 million Christian Armenians during and after World War I by the Ottoman Empire. Now, before I go on, let me tell you that in a few seconds, we will put on the video of the introduction of the panel that I spoke to, and then my presentation, which was done with great care, and I truly enjoyed participating in this particular panel. You'll see that in a few seconds.
Our next speaker will be the Mr. Raul Lowery-Contreras, independent broadcast media professional. He will touch upon the Armenian violence in Nagorno-Karabakh area as well.
Thank you. And thanks to the Turkish government and all of you here today for inviting me. This is quite an adventure, because since I got involved with the question of the Karabakh It's been 8 years now. In those 8 years, I have flown over 90,000 miles from Los Angeles to Istanbul to Baku. However that many times is, 7, I think, or 8. And by the way, I look forward, Mr. Ambassador, one of these days, spending more than 2 hours at the Istanbul airport so I can look at the country and appreciate it for what it is. Let me first give you a reason why I'm interested in Turkey and the Turkish people. Some years ago, when I was 11, 1952, the United States and Turkey were at war with the North Korean communists and the Chinese communists. You all remember that. That was Turkey's first activity in the United Nations. It was a United Nations effort run basically from across the street, although those buildings weren't there then. I had a substitute history teacher just back from the Korean War. He had been called up and drafted, and he was just released from, because in those days you served your 2 years, and even though we were still in the middle of a war. And he didn't have much to say about history, but like most substitute teachers, he just told us stories to entertain us, to babysit us until the real teacher got back. And he told a story of being on the front lines against the Chinese communists. And he explained that one day an order came down, some sergeant gathered up some guys and said, we're going to do a patrol, and our orders are to capture 3 or 4 communist soldiers so we can interrogate them and gather an intelligence. And so they prepared to go. The Turks got the same order. The Turks a battalion was right next to them. And they went out on their separate paths. They came back in the morning. The Americans, the patrol, had captured 3 Chinese communists. And they were happy because it was more than 1 and more than 0. And then the Turks came in with their prisoners to turn over to the intelligence people. They brought back 100 prisoners. And when he told that story, I was a very impressionable 12-year-old living in a neighborhood with World War II veterans, Marines, soldiers, and sailors in San Diego, from where the Pacific War entirely was fought. Forget San Francisco, forget Los Angeles. All the Marines that went to fight in the war, all the sailors that went to fight in the Pacific War came out of San Diego, were trained there and stationed there. And so I was up to here with World War II, and then I hear this great story of about 100 prisoners taken by the Turkish soldiers and turned over, and the Americans had 3. I have loved Turkey and Turkish soldiers ever since. So that's my reason for my basic interest. The Professor Erickson was correct, and so was my colleague here, that in fact the narrative has been lost. The minute I wrote anything about Azerbaijan and Baku and the Karabakh War that went to ceasefire in 1994, I was immediately attacked. Now remember, the largest Armenian population in the United States is just 100 miles from where I live, Los Angeles. And they are so radical, and it really irritates me because in doing all my research to write I have 2 books actually, besides this one, Murder in the Mountains, which is about the Karabakh War and what happened the night of February 26, 1992, the war crime committed against men, women, and children as young as 2 years old by Armenian irregulars. And this is where research and history come to play. I don't know how many of you know, but at the war crime in Khojaly, at the massacre in Khojaly, there were not just Armenians there. There was an entire 1st Mechanized Infantry of the Russian army. It wasn't irregulars, it wasn't Chechens or whatever. It was regular Russian army under orders from Moscow to fight side by side with the Armenian irregulars. The Russians had tanks, the Armenians didn't have any tanks. The Russians had artillery, the Armenians didn't have any artillery. And so that great massacre, it wasn't that many people, and it doesn't compare to the numbers thrown around about 1915. But as a former United States Marine, it irritates me to see bodies of children that have been killed for no reason other than they were Azerbaijanis. That irritates me. And when I get irritated and have access to research, I am thrilled at doing that research because it opens up my eyes to much more. I mean, living in San Diego, California is as far as you can get from New York City in the United States, on the continental United States. And we're right next to Mexico. We have our own situation there. But the idea of seeing babies killed because they're Azerbaijanis truly irritates me. Now, I did spend 8 years as a United States Marine. I should have learned something. But you know, in that 8 years, and that included a part of the Vietnam War, I never heard a shot fired in anger by anybody until I was in the at the line of conflict between what they call Artsakh, the Armenian protectorate in the Karabakh, and the Azerbaijani lines in a no man's land area in between. It was barren. The villages had all been taken away, and the Armenians were 500 meters that way, and the Azerbaijanis were behind me. I was actually in between them. And I heard artillery being fired, and it was going up over my head towards Azerbaijan, and it was being fired by the Armenians. And that was my first exposure to combat, if you will. And I thought, how can this be? In this year, in this century, when all these arguments have been going on for so long, and they can't make a resolution. It doesn't take brilliance to bring peace to an area. When the people, before the Ottoman Empire collapsed, lived in peace. They lived with each other. They intermarried. They were, like the professor said, multi-millionaire Armenians in Istanbul. And same thing with the Jewish people. And then all of this Armenian thing comes along, and one of the first groups they attack is the Jews in Istanbul. That this was a Jewish plot to get rid of Armenian competition in the 5 and 10 cent stores, or whatever they were running. I mean, think about that. The Armenians blaming the Jews for convincing the sultans to eliminate the Armenian population, which they didn't do, did they? They didn't do. A lot of them just hopped on ferries in the Caspian Sea and went to Russia, which has the largest Armenian population outside of Armenia right now. And then there's the United States and France and wherever they are. The professor was right. The narrative was lost long before I came along. But I have done my best to look into the facts. In this book, I have interviews with 2 women, and they were both captured on the night of February 26th. One of them had just had a baby 3 nights before, and Armenian soldiers grabbed her baby and threw it to the ground. The child survived, but he just died a couple of years ago from wounds and problems that developed from that night that he was thrown to an ice-hard road by an Armenian terrorist. And the other lady told a story, and we had to have an interpreter. I tape recorded it for posterity reasons, it turns out. And it was so serious, a story that she told. Now, I'm a very good questioner. If you ever get interviewed by me, you're going to get interviewed by me, because I pride myself. Every comma, every question mark, every question that deserves to be asked, I will ask it, because time means nothing to me. If I'm going to interview you or you, and it's a controversial subject, I'm going to wring every detail out of you, because that's the way I am. I am a former United States Marine, and I have a mission to accomplish, and that is to find the truth. When this lady told me her story, and how she was gang raped by 30 or 40 Armenians, she lost track, I actually was so touched by this story. Now picture this, big tough Raul, the Marine, and I cried. I didn't bawl, I just had tears running down my face, because I had never heard such a story being told by someone that actually went through it. I've seen stories like that, and I wonder if the interviewers were as affected as I was, but I was that day. And I will rely on her, and remember, she had a general idea of what questions I was going to ask. I wasn't the first to interview her. But we spent almost 2.5 hours. And I was interviewed for tried to listen to me for 2.5 hours. So, in any event, I was really struck with it. I really got into it. Then it was after that interview, which I did in Los Angeles, that I went to Baku for the first time. And there I met refugees. Now remember, I came out of World War II. I was a child and I already knew what was going on. And I cheered the Marines in the newsreels and the movies. And I had neighbors that were there. And I had questioned all of them. If those that would talk, they will talk to children. And I was 6 years old and I was already determined to join the United States Marines the minute they let me. If they had let me at 10, I would have joined at 10. But we examined this situation and examined it. I did. And then my editor, who made me edit probably 50 times, I got so sick of the material because I had to read it so many times. I got to Baku, and they were taking me around, showing me, and we went to a displaced camp, a former school. All these are Azerbaijanis that had been deported, relocated, as the Armenians like to say, from Armenia and the Karabakh, where their families had lived for centuries, where they had lived side by side with the Armenians, had intermarried with them. We've heard this story before. We heard it a little while ago, didn't we? And everything was fine until the Armenians decided they wanted the Karabakh, and they started a war, and they started pushing people out, getting rid of them, then had a phony referendum to declare independence and then to attach to Armenia. And they did all this by relocating 300,000, 400,000 Azerbaijanis who had been living in Armenia for centuries, some of them. And they were packed up and just shoved out. And if they didn't move fast enough, they were shot and they were killed. And I met these survivors at these various camps and villages that the Azerbaijani government had to set up to take care of these people. They had nowhere to go. And I talked to them, and I never forget the first visit to the first camp, and it was like I was a Hollywood movie star showing up. Let me tell you something. They just crowded all around, and then the women came out. They'd baked their bread, which I don't remember the name of it now. You all know what I'm talking about, and I'm sure you do. They came and they surrounded me, and none of them could speak English, so I had to work with the translators. And the most common phrase that I heard, which again caused me to have tears, and like I say, I'm a big tough guy. We want to go home. We want to go home. I must have heard that 1,000 times on my visits to Baku and Azerbaijan and Cuba and Samgate and all the places that I visited where allegedly Azerbaijanis had performed genocide on Armenians, which was not true. In Samgate, I think it was 1989 or 90, 29 people died in a riot when it was under Russian, Soviet control. It wasn't an Azerbaijani police that shot people. It was the Soviet police. And I heard this, we want to go home. And it just really bounced around in my head. I had never had people, of course, I'd never dealt with refugees before. That was my first experience with refugees, except for people that came to the United States after World War II. In which many came, and Arab Christians that came in 1947-48 when the war broke out of independence for Israel. I met my first Arabs in 1948, kids like me, Catholics, from where? The Middle East? I didn't know. I found out fast enough. we worked together, we played together. They taught me all the Arabic cuss words, and I taught them all the ones in Spanish. We had this joint experience that developed eventually to where I could go to the Middle East and actually talk to people who I was acquainted with. I was not acquainted with Azerbaijanis or Turks. I had never met a Turk in my life until I stopped at the Istanbul airport the first time. And then on subsequent visits. And even though I had my experience about loving the Turkish soldiers in 1952. Anyway, the misinformation campaign, the only way to challenge it is like the professor said, we must work to change the narrative. That's why I made such a big deal about, pardon me, I lost my train of thought. I made such a big deal about the Russian soldiers, because number one, I don't like Russians. I never have liked the Soviets. I hate the Soviets to this day, and they're still running it, by proxy by Mr. Putin. And it's really funny because when Turkey got involved in the First World War, the first big battle they fought was against the Russians, and the Russians won. Then they tried to take the Suez Canal. The Turks tried to take the Suez Canal so they could cut off the transportation of 1 million Indian soldiers to Europe. They weren't fighting for India, they were fighting for the British. And then they fought a battle with the Brits. I think it was Kars, one of those towns, probably in the Euphrates Valley. And the Brits beat them. So those coincidences, along with the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, and then this Armenian thing, because of the diaspora's propaganda, all those things combined to cause World War I in the area, in the Middle East. And then when the war was over, what was left? Well, there was the Arab problem, which still goes on today. People are being shot today in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is not really related. But the British drew some maps, and they took Iraq for themselves, the Transjordan for themselves, and parts of what became other countries. And then the French took Syria, and the Ottoman Empire disappeared. But then came the rise of Ataturk, which brought Turkey into the modern world, and was quite a man from what I understand. All these problems that we basically have today, they're still fighting in Syria, they're still fighting in Iraq. The Iranians are acting uppity and are causing problems for everybody. The Kurds are not happy, the Turks are not happy with the Kurds, and all these things occur today. And they started 100 years ago, almost to the day. So it takes guys like me to get interested in something like this. This is the only book on Khojaly published in the United States. I wish I could say there were 100, but there aren't. But the only way to chip away at the wall of misinformation is to chip away one book at a time. Thank you. I will answer your questions when you have them, if you have them.
Thank you, Mr. Contreras. It was quite impressive information by personally your experience in the Khojaly region and in general sense.
Between 1914 and 1918, Great Britain, France, Italy, and British territories New Zealand, India, Australia, Canada, and the Russian Empire were united in fighting Germany. That was before the United States got into the war. They fought Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, which is now called Turkey. Supporting the Western Europeans and Russians, Armenians living in Russian-controlled Armenia and in the eastern provinces of what is now Turkey, there was no independent Armenia during this war. Because of this support by declared enemies of the Ottomans and an Arab revolt in and around what is known as the Arab Peninsula and the Palestine-Syria area, were a large Armenian presence, And in the Caucasus region, and they also, of course, were Armenians in the Caucasus region. Now, the Ottoman leaders decided to relocate Armenians from the eastern provinces of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire, closest to Armenia. Why? Because they didn't trust Armenians, who were very pro-Russian and pro-British. Entire Russian army battalions of Armenians fought against the Ottomans. For all intents and purposes, Christian Armenians, by their very existence or presence, threatened the Ottoman Empire's existence, despite spending centuries living together in peace and harmony with Muslims. The Armenians were a potential fifth column, a definition created during the Spanish Civil War. Coincidentally, the word genocide also was created in Europe by actions of the same people, fascists, who created the fifth column phrase. Those people created death camps to eliminate an entire population of fellow Europeans who chose to practice their religion differently than their majority Christian neighbors. The Ottomans, on the other hand, set out not to eliminate the Armenian population that favored the British and Russians, but to relocate the potential problem population to other Ottoman territory far away. Yes, they didn't move people around on air-conditioned buses because air-conditioned buses didn't exist 100 years ago. They moved the Armenians mostly on foot. The relocation is similar to what the United States did with indigenous Indians from the southeast states of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida in the 1830s, when President Andrew Jackson ordered the relocation of 60,000 Indians from territory he felt should only be owned by his fellow white Americans. Many of the 60,000 died, especially children who were devastated by diseases like dysentery. Another American relocation, this time for national security, occurred in 1942 when I was a child of almost 2. Men, women, and children born in the United States and their parents and grandparents born in Japan were rounded up at gunpoint, loaded onto trains, and sent to camps in desolate deserts in California, Nevada, Arizona, and other places hundreds and thousands of miles from their homes in California. Their properties were legally stolen through government unpaid tax sales of real estate owned by the relocated who couldn't pay their taxes from their barbed wire surrounded camps. They were denied the right to vote in the elections of 1942 and 1944 by the simple expedient that they couldn't leave camp to vote in California. There were not absentee ballots for these mostly U.S. citizens. Why were these mostly American citizens relocated? Because the people who ran the United States were concerned that these people, weren't loyal Americans, that they would act as spies or another fifth column in the critical state of California. The Golden State was home to America's nascent airplane industry, and it housed, and still does, the United States Navy and U.S. Marine facilities that were instrumental in fighting and winning the entire Pacific War against Japan. The Ottomans relocated many Armenians, but unlike the Germans of the 1930s and 40s, they didn't specifically intend to eliminate the Armenian population. They wanted them away from areas where their concentration could cause security problems. Otherwise, they would simply have killed them, like the Nazi Germans did with the Jews of Europe. Relocation may be proof to objective observers, historians and scholars, that murderous intent was not on the minds of the Ottomans. With thousands of Armenians serving in the Russian army, can anyone argue with an Ottoman suspicion that eastern provinces heavily populated by Armenians were susceptible to undercurrents of support for Russian and British armies fighting Ottoman troops? We call that situation potentially treason. What the Germans did during the 30s and 40s, in addition to planning and building the death camps, makes what the Ottomans did seem like little to be concerned about, as World War I is remembered far more for battles in which thousands upon thousands of soldiers died in combat and civilians died in similar numbers. This was the bloodiest war ever fought up to the war. World War I. A massive world war sparked by the assassination of one man, an archduke, in an empire that itself didn't survive the war. The Germans documented what they did. Plans were drafted and implemented by their cohorts and allies in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Hungary, and their own forces in Poland and Russia. In Russia and the Ukraine, regular German army soldiers, conscripts, draftees, were organized into death squads that murdered thousands upon thousands of Jewish men, women, and children. Adding to this effort to that of organized camps in Poland and Germany, along with the intricate German planning plus the paperwork of camp administration, the Allies who defeated Germany found a mountain of physical evidence with which to use in courts to punish German murderers after the war. This provides us today with the ultimate war crime example of how to define and punish war crimes and/or genocide. More importantly, the German genocide aimed at the entire Jewish population under their control, from the Atlantic coast deep into Eastern Europe and Russia on the east and the Mediterranean on the south. The word genocide didn't exist until the Germans actually created, implemented, perfected, and perpetrated the ultimate crime against humanity. The Ottoman Empire did not predate the Germans of Hitler and their millions of war crimes of intentionally, literally murdering millions of men, women, and children. No, they did it differently. For example, at the April 23rd gathering in New York of a Call to Truth, Historical Facts of 1915 events, American history professor Edward J. Erickson asked some very interesting questions based on facts he is knowledgeable of that were unchallengeable. German death camps were designed not to imprison or to hold, but to kill. Millions of German documents clearly prove that. Physical evidence of gas chambers, human remains, and proofs such as shoes, human hair, jewelry, and clothing, plus eyewitness accounts spectacularly combined to define and prove genocide. Were Ottoman camps in the Syrian desert that Armenians were relocated to designed to kill people? No. No one has ever produced any evidence that they were. Were relocated Armenians allowed to leave their desert camps? Yes, they could and did. They left for jobs they could get in neighboring towns. They could leave to shop for food, clothing, or whatever in neighboring towns. They could leave camp to go into neighboring towns to draw cash from banks. Yes, Armenian relatives in Constantinople, including multimillionaires in Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire, and other cities and towns sent money to banks near camps where their relatives could pick up the money to use for clothing, food, and necessities they needed. Did German camps allow inmates to leave camp? No. Did German camps allow inmates to leave camps and secure employment in neighboring towns or cities? No. Did German administrators of the report to and run the death camps, did they allow relatives to send money to banks so inmates could use the money to buy food or necessities? No. Were the Ottoman camps in the Syrian desert death camps? No. Another interesting fact that smartly dismisses Armenian claims that genocide, quote unquote, was the criminal intent that existed or didn't exist in 1915 or in the following years is this. Did the German government arrest, convict, and/or punish any officers or enlisted personnel for crimes against inmates of the death camps in the 1930s and 1940s? The answer is a resounding no. Did the Ottoman government arrest, convict, and punish any Ottoman soldiers, officers, or enlisted men for crimes against Armenians in the Syrian desert camps or on long marches from the eastern provinces to the Syrian desert? No. Actually, the government of Turkey did try at least 1,500 officers we saw in one letter, where they had officers and enlisted men charged with various crimes, war crimes, and they were convicted. Some were executed, some were imprisoned, and they were all discharged from the army. The Ottomans did not criminally slaughter the Armenian people at these camps or on the long marches to them from eastern provinces. They did not, despite what you hear from the Armenian lobby. The arguments continue on both sides of the question of whether or not the Ottoman Turks committed genocide against Armenians, but for once arguments are being made against flagrant charges by people who weren't there and by their champions who, with American dollars, are working hard to smear a nation that is an ally of the United States and that has fought side by side with Americans in a war in which 34,000 Americans died. Briefly, let's move on to Mexico. Mexico, there is a gigantic struggle going on right now between the president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, and the established and very old Mexican Supreme Court. Why? Because the Mexican Supreme Court has ruled against the president in his attempt to merge the National Guard into the Mexican Army. The National Guard, by constitutional provision, is to be led by a civilian. That's point one. Point two, the Supreme Court overruled the president when he tried to abolish the National Electoral Institute that establishes and creates and administers huge free elections in Mexico, and has been doing so since 2000, when the opposition won the presidency, and in 2006, when that same party won the presidency and defeated Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. He still claims he won that election. So he tried to abolish it by a constitutional amendment, but he didn't have the two-thirds majority in the Mexican Congress to make that happen. So he came up with a plan B. He tried to do it by normal parliamentary procedures. And the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, he couldn't do that because what he did, the procedures he used were not by law or by policy or by the Constitution. In other words, he just put together a plan, said, this is what I want, and gave it to Congress, and they approved it with a majority. But that wasn't enough. They didn't go through the procedure. Now, so there was that huge defeat by the Supreme Court. And they just came through again and turned down a proposition that was proposed by the Mexican president. And the Supreme Court said no, and that they couldn't do it. This is, among other things, he's trying to, he has issued decrees, like dictators do, that, for example, make the construction of his favorite project, the railroad in the 5 southeastern states, including Yucatan. He's tried to, his decree says that this is a situation of national security. Therefore, there is nothing the government has to do to build this railroad to satisfy existing laws, policies, or the Constitution, because it's a national security situation, this tourist train that he's trying to build down there and destroying the Yucatan jungle in the process. So there we have it. The Supreme Court stopped in and said, no, stopped him again and said, no, you can't do that. So Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who is president until next year, the election next year will replace him, is trying to rig the election so that his party will win no matter what, and to eliminate government oversight, public oversight of construction projects he has assigned to the Mexican Army, which has no experience on building railroads or airports. The airport they built doesn't work right. And of course, he has tried to enlarge the Army, making it larger, having more generals that are in charge of construction projects that obviously skim off the top and put the pesos in their pocket, and the Secretary of Defense and everybody else, they're all involved in this. The Supreme Court says no. So now he wants to replace the Supreme Court. This is his latest trick. He wants to put a plebiscite, a referendum actually, on the Mexican ballot next year at a cost of billions of pesos to determine whether his plan for the Supreme Court should become effective. What's his plan? No longer will the executive nominate justices to the Supreme Court of Mexico that then must be confirmed by the Mexican Senate. It's the same system basically that we have here in the United States. No, no, no. He wants to have the parties, his party, the predominant party right now, for example, nominate people for seats on the Supreme Court and elect them with the popular vote by party label. Where would justice go then? Partisan politics, politicians and politics aren't known for equality, fraternity, and liberty. They're known as political hacks. We see that in some states in the United States, especially down south. You will remember how every single judge down south, except federal judges, always ruled in favor of segregation, lynchings, and keeping millions of blacks from voting. Every court, every state court. There was never a state court that ruled against any of those things because they were all political appointees. That's it for today. And if you have friends that haven't seen the program and you like this program, suggest it to them. They can go down YouTube and subscribe there, and then they will be notified. They will be notified when we present a new program. And of course, you can tell your friends that have Roku that they can watch it there too. They know how to get their channels onto their favorites, so they can do that and watch us all the time. And we have all the past episodes of the Contreras Report there. If you have any questions or comments, the email address will be on in a few seconds. Please write it down and let us know. Or on YouTube, you can actually comment right there with the report. So thank you for being there. Thank you for telling your friends. And thank you for looking forward to the next Contreras Report. I am Raul Lowry Contreras. It has been my pleasure to have spent this time with you, and we look forward to the next time. Thank you.